Continue to follow breaking news tonight in the search for the body of 4-year-old Javea Harris after her parents confessed to killing her and her mother admitted to disposing of her body. Today, dozens of cars lined the outside of their home as investigators and the coroner's office sifted through evidence.
4 days. That's how long 200 officers, FBI agents, and volunteers searched 5,000 acres of South Carolina woodland for a 4-year-old girl. Helicopters overhead, drones scanning tree lines. Roadblocks stopping every car that came near the search zone. A church turned into a command center before sunrise, every single morning, for 4 straight days. And on the 4th day, the sheriff stood at a podium and said the search had never had a chance of succeeding, because by his own investigators' estimate, the little girl they were looking for had already been dead for a month. Not 4 days, a month, which means somebody knew exactly what those 4 days of searching were never going to find. And they let it happen anyway. This is the case of Meria Harris. And before we get into what investigators believe happened inside that house, I want you to sit with one question, because it's the question this entire case revolves around. If you already know a search isn't going to find anyone alive, what does it take to stand in front of a camera, cry, and ask the world to help you look anyway? Let's go back to the beginning. Before we get into it, one thing worth being upfront about. Everything you're about to hear is built from public statements, press conferences, and an on-camera interview one of the parents gave during the investigation. Some of it is established fact. Some of it is allegation that a jury hasn't tested yet. I'll try to be clear about which is which as we go, because in a case like this, that distinction is the entire story. Aiken County, South Carolina isn't the kind of place true crime cameras usually point at. It's the kind of place with dirt driveways and porch lights that come on at dusk, where, as more than one neighbor would later tell reporters, everybody knows everybody's kids. Hillsborough Street and Ridgecrest Road, modest houses, long yards, chickens pecking around in the dirt. The kind of block where a missing child search feels less like breaking news and more like a rupture in the fabric of the place itself. Meria was 4 years old, 3.5 feet tall, 42 pounds. She liked Minnie Mouse. She liked chasing the chickens in the yard. Neighbors described her, almost universally, the same way. Polite almost to a fault. The kind of kid who said, yes ma'am and no ma'am, without being told to. The kind of kid raised to be trusting of adults. A trait that, as this case unfolds, takes on a much darker weight than it should. She lived in that house with her parents. Meria Harris, 23. Mitchell Herring, 22. Young. The kind of young couple a neighbor waves to without a second thought. Nobody's idea of the family that ends up at the center of a 5,000-acre manhunt. On a Tuesday evening, sometime around 8:15 p.m., according to the story her parents would go on to tell police, Meria was playing outside near the chickens. Pink Disney shirt, shorts, pink beads in her hair, her Crocs. Her mother said that was the last time she saw her. Her father said he'd been out running errands, a laundromat, a gas station, a store or two, for close to an hour and a half, and came home to find the house surrounded by police. Somewhere in the gap between those two accounts, a 4-year-old girl vanished. And here's the part worth sitting with before the story picks up speed. Nothing about this setup sounds unusual. A summer evening, chickens in a yard, a mother inside the house, a father out running errands. If you didn't know how this story ends, you'd assume it was the most mundane Tuesday in America. That's not a coincidence. That's how almost every case like this starts, with a version of events ordinary enough that nobody questions it. Nobody opens an investigation assuming the worst. They assume a scared 4-year-old wandered further than she should have, that she's frightened somewhere in the dark, that time is the only enemy. That assumption is what pulls 200 people into the search within 24 hours. It's also, as you're about to see, the exact assumption that falls apart first. Think about what it actually takes to organize a search like the one that followed. It takes a community that believes, wholeheartedly, that a child might still be found. It takes volunteers willing to walk through snake-infested brush in 90-degree heat because there's a chance, just a chance, that at the end of that walk is a scared little girl instead of something no one wants to say out loud. That belief doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from the story the family told and from how convincingly they told it. Which is exactly why what happened over the following 4 days deserves this much attention. Because if that belief turned out to be misplaced from the very first hour, then every single person who walked those woods was operating on borrowed time they never should have had to spend. Within hours, this stopped being a local matter. The Aiken County Sheriff's Office called in the FBI. South Carolina's State Law Enforcement Division joined next. Search and rescue teams poured in from across the region. 9 units, drones, helicopters, working through South Carolina heat that made every single hour brutal. A local church, Bethel Baptist, became ground zero for the entire operation. Investigators met there before sunrise, every morning, for 4 days straight. Digital billboards along the highway carried Meria's photo, donated by a local advertising company, asking anyone with information to come forward. Deputies ran roadblocks near the search zone, stopping cars, checking vehicles, chasing every tip that came in, some nights not wrapping up until well after dark. By day 3, more than 200 people were involved in some capacity. FBI agents, sheriff's deputies, volunteer fire departments from 3 counties over. By the time the search wound down, crews had covered more than 5,000 acres. The FBI's special agent in charge would later confirm something that tells you how seriously this was being treated from day 1. The response included the Bureau's Behavioral Analysis Unit and its Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team, specialists who exist specifically for cases like this one. From the outside, it looked exactly like what everyone feared and hoped wasn't true at the same time. A race against the clock to bring a little girl home alive. But underneath that visible search, something didn't sit right from the very beginning. As reporters worked the neighborhood door to door, a pattern started to surface. And it wasn't about the night she went missing. It was about the weeks before it. Neighbor after neighbor told the same story. In slightly different words, they hadn't seen Meria in a long time. Not days, not weeks, months. If that's true, the entire foundation the search was built on, a child last seen playing in her yard on a Tuesday evening, was already standing on ground that wasn't solid. And once you know that detail, everything before it needs a second look. It's worth pausing here on what this search actually cost the people carrying it out, because that part rarely makes it into how these stories get told. Search and rescue work on a case like this isn't just physical exhaustion, it's psychological. Every single person walking those 5,000 acres was doing it while holding on to the hope, or at least the possibility, that the outcome at the end might be a child found alive. That's what gets a volunteer out of bed before dawn for 4 straight days. That's what gets a deputy to keep working a shift well past dark. What does it do to 200 people to spend 4 days inside that mindset, moving through heat and uncertain terrain, only to learn afterward that the search may have been built on a false premise from the very first hour? That's not a question this case can answer for the people who lived it, but it's a question worth carrying forward, because at the exact same time all of that was happening in public, the sheriff's office was already running something the public didn't know about yet. There's a detail worth including here from a private investigator who spoke to local reporters during the search, unconnected to the case itself. She noted that even as the visible footprint of the search seemed to shrink day by day, fewer boots on the ground, fewer helicopters overhead, the investigation itself hadn't slowed down at all. What the public sees during a case like this, and what's actually happening behind it, are almost never running at the same pace. Interviews were being conducted, records were being pulled, neighbors were being reapproached, sometimes more than once, as investigators cross-checked one account against another. By the time the visible search looked, from the outside, like it was winding down, the quieter half of the investigation was actually speeding up. That distinction matters for understanding what came next, because it means the sheriff's 4th-day announcement wasn't the product of a sudden discovery. It was the product of 4 days of 2 searches running side by side, one looking for a living child in the woods, the other looking somewhere else entirely. At some point during the investigation, Meria Harris sat down and gave his own account of that day, the kind of interview that ends up shaping how the public sees a case, for better or worse. It's worth understanding on its own terms, because it is genuinely hard to follow. He described getting up, watching his daughter play outside for a while, then leaving the house sometime around 6 or 7 in the morning. From there, his timeline starts to loop. 3 different stores, back to a laundromat by a gas station, another store, back again, buying drinks, watching laundry, seeing police activity nearby and assuming it had nothing to do with him. By the time he got back toward his own street, he says he saw a police truck with a drone overhead and sped up, thinking something had happened close to home. When he arrived, he found what he describes as a whole bunch of police, and assumed, because his girlfriend was due to give birth any day, that she'd gone into labor. It wasn't until he got out of the car, he says, that he learned his daughter was the reason for all of it. Here's the detail that's easy to miss on a first pass. Mitchell really did go into labor that same night, after Meria was reported missing, and gave birth hours later. In the middle of the same 911 call, the same police response, the same swarm of officers and drones. So here's the honest question, the one worth sitting with instead of rushing past. Is this what shock sounds like? People in acute crisis lose the thread of time. Details blur. Errands get told out of order, because trauma doesn't organize memory the way a police report does. That's real. It's documented. And it happens to genuinely innocent people on the worst day of their lives. But it's also true that a looping, inconsistent timeline is one of the first things investigators flag, not because someone is grieving, but because a story that's been rehearsed enough times starts to show its seams under repetition, without being airtight enough to survive real scrutiny. Both of those readings are real possibilities. Neither one cancels out the other. There's one more layer to his account worth pulling apart, because it's the part that carries the most apparent emotion. Early media coverage described Meria as possibly nonverbal, possibly on the autism spectrum. Her father disputed that directly and unprompted, insisting she was sharp, talkative, better with people than he was, and said the mischaracterization unsettled him because it meant the description going out to searchers might not have matched who his daughter actually was. That's a strange thing to be upset about if you already know the search is never going to find anyone. It's also exactly the kind of detail a person clinging to a story they've decided to tell might raise, because getting the small things right is how a bigger story holds together. Both readings sit uncomfortably close to each other. Neither cancels the other out. That's the trap at the center of a case like this. Authenticity and rehearsal can sound identical from the outside. The only thing that actually separates them is evidence the public doesn't have access to yet. And it wasn't just the father's account that reporters were picking apart. Up and down Hillsborough Street and Ridgecrest Road, the same detail kept surfacing, phrased slightly differently by different people, but landing in the same place every time. One neighbor, interviewed on camera, put it about as plainly as it can be put. The family had lived in the area for years. Everyone knew everyone's kids. And for a little girl who supposedly lived right around the corner to have gone unseen for as long as people were describing, somebody would have noticed her walking by. That's the kind of comment that sounds small in isolation, and enormous once you know what comes later in this story. Another resident described being woken up in the middle of the night by deputies going door to door, and admitted that even with how close the search was to her own home, part of her still couldn't fully process that a child could disappear from a street she'd lived on for years, without anyone noticing something was wrong. That's a common thread in cases like this one. Not suspicion exactly, but a kind of quiet disbelief that runs through an entire block once a search like this lands on it. People start replaying the last few weeks in their heads, trying to remember the last time they actually saw the child in question. For a lot of people on that street, the honest answer was that they couldn't remember at all. There's also a detail the father raised himself, unprompted, in his own account. He told investigators there had been people snooping around the house in the days before Meria was reported missing. People on the phone, walking slowly past the property, behavior he said he'd flagged before. Whether that detail points somewhere real, or whether it's the kind of thing a person reaches for when they sense the ground shifting under their own story, isn't something this case has settled. But it's part of the record, and it's worth knowing before we get to what investigators were doing behind the scenes. Because what came next suggests they had already stopped waiting to find out. Here's what most people watching this case never picked up on. While the visible search was running, the drones, the helicopters, the roadblocks, there was a second investigation running in parallel, and it wasn't looking at the woods at all. At a press conference partway through the search, the sheriff mentioned almost in passing, that alongside the search effort making headlines, another team was working the case from a different angle entirely, off-site, doing what he only described as their job. Small phrase, enormous weight in hindsight. A missing 4-year-old in the earliest hours of a case gets one kind of response: search and rescue, canvassing, tip lines, drones over open land. What the sheriff was describing was something else. A team not looking for a lost child in the woods, but looking at the people closest to her, from nearly the beginning. Ask yourself why a department runs 2 operations like that simultaneously. One has to be public. You can't search 5,000 acres quietly. The other doesn't need to be seen at all, and arguably works better if it isn't. By day 4, that second track had apparently caught up to and then overtaken the first. When a reporter later pressed the sheriff on exactly when the case shifted from a missing person search to a homicide investigation, his answer was carefully hedged. He said he didn't want to get behind the 8 ball, his words, and that the FBI had been brought in early, specifically so investigators wouldn't be playing catch-up if the case turned into something worse than a wandering child. He wouldn't give an exact moment when investigators concluded she wasn't going to be found in those woods. What he did say was that once the off-site team determined she was, in his words, not there anymore, the visible search's purpose changed, even if its footprint on the ground didn't shrink right away. Sit with that phrase for a second. Not there anymore. That's a strange way to describe a child who, if her parents' account were true, should never have been anywhere except that yard in the first place. The moment investigators started talking about her that way is the moment this stopped being a search for a missing child, even though the public wouldn't be told that in plain language for another day or two. It's worth pausing here to really understand what a dual-track investigation like this looks like from the inside, because it's rarely explained well in coverage of cases like this one. On one track, you have the version everyone can see: search grids mapped out over aerial photography, K9 units working scent lines, tip hotlines fielding calls from anyone who thinks they might have spotted something. That track exists because it has to. It's the version of an investigation the public needs to see in order to keep believing, in order to keep volunteering, in order to keep hope alive long enough for a case to actually get solved if there's still time to solve it. The second track doesn't work that way at all. It works by asking quieter questions to the people closest to the child. Phone records, financial records, timeline reconciliation, forensic testing on anything recovered from the property itself. It works by treating everyone in that household as a potential witness and a potential suspect simultaneously. Because in the earliest hours of any case like this, investigators don't yet know which one any given person actually is. Running both at once isn't unusual. It's actually standard practice in child abduction cases, precisely because statistics on cases like this are grim, and investigators know it going in. The overwhelming majority of harm that comes to a young child who disappears comes from someone already inside their life, not a stranger. That's not speculation about this specific case. That's just what decades of these cases, nationally, have shown investigators to expect, which is exactly why a behavioral analysis team and a household-focused track get deployed early, quietly, even while helicopters are still in the air looking for a happier outcome. On the 4th morning, the sheriff stood at a podium and delivered what he called the hardest announcement of his 36-year career. The investigation, he said, now led them to believe Meria was deceased, not missing, not still out there, gone, and gone, in his estimate, for roughly a month before that 911 call was ever placed. The night of the call, he said, it was already too late to save her. There's a temptation, telling a story like this, to pile commentary on top of a moment like that. It doesn't need it. A sheriff with nearly 4 decades on the job, standing in front of cameras, telling a community that the search they'd poured 4 days and thousands of acres into was, from the very beginning, a search for a body and not a child. That moment carries its own weight without any help. He also used part of that same press conference to thank an unusually long list of people and agencies by name: sheriffs from neighboring counties, fire departments, emergency management officials, the church that had hosted the command post since before dawn on the very first morning. It's easy to read a section like that as procedural, the obligatory thank you list every official gives at a podium. But listen to it again, knowing what came 2 minutes later, and it reads differently. This was a sheriff closing out one chapter of an operation, the search and rescue chapter, before opening a second one that had almost nothing to do with rescue at all. He was thanking the people who'd spent 4 days looking for a living child in the same breath as preparing to tell them she hadn't been alive to find. That's a strange, quiet kind of grief to watch play out in a press conference. Whatever the eventual legal outcome of this case, that room full of exhausted volunteers and officers absorbed something that morning that will never show up in any court filing. The knowledge that everything they'd given those 4 days to had already been decided weeks before they ever put their boots on. The FBI agent who followed him at the podium thanked the community and said the investigation was now about pursuing justice. When a reporter asked how investigators determined she'd been dead for a month, he declined to answer. Some things stay behind the case file, even at the hardest point in an investigation. That same day, the sheriff announced the arrests. Meria's father was charged with homicide by child abuse. Her mother was charged with the same offense, plus an additional charge, filing a false police report. It's worth understanding what homicide by child abuse actually means under South Carolina law, because it isn't the same thing as a standard murder charge, and the difference matters for what a jury will eventually have to decide. Under the statute, someone is guilty of this offense if they cause a child's death while committing abuse or neglect, and that death happens under circumstances showing extreme indifference to human life, or if they knowingly help someone else commit abuse or neglect that results in a child's death. Neglect, under the same law, includes failing to provide adequate food, shelter, or medical care, where that failure leads to a fatal injury, and it includes abandonment resulting in death. The charge carries a mandatory minimum of 20 years and can carry a life sentence. What that means practically: prosecutors don't necessarily have to prove one deliberate violent act on one specific date, the way a traditional murder charge requires. They can build a case around a pattern: abuse, neglect, indifference sustained over time, that ultimately proved fatal. That opens the door to a very different kind of evidence than a single incident homicide would. Patterns of behavior in the household, any prior injuries, statements from people who spent time around the family, and whatever forensic evidence exists once, or if, her remains are recovered. And the second charge against her mother is worth sitting with on its own. Filing a false police report exists specifically for situations where someone reports something they already know isn't true. Which means, independent of whatever a jury decides about the homicide charge, that charge alone is an allegation that the original 911 call, the crying, the description of the pink beads, the 4 days of searching that followed, was not what it appeared to be from its very first sentence. None of this has been tested in front of a jury. No judge has ruled on any of it. As of now, Meria's remains still haven't been recovered, which means even the sheriff's own timeline, roughly a month, is something a future trial still has to prove, not something already settled. It's also worth understanding something specific written into South Carolina's statute, because it tells you how often an excuse like this has been raised in cases just like it. The law is explicit that a child's crying cannot be treated as provocation and cannot be used as a mitigating factor in a homicide by child abuse case. That line exists in the text of the law for a reason. Lawmakers didn't write it in hypothetically. They wrote it in because defense attorneys, in case after case before this one, had tried to use exactly that argument in court. Whether that detail ends up mattering here is something only a trial will reveal, but it tells you the kind of ground this particular charge has been built to cover. There's also a practical dimension to the charges that rarely gets discussed online, and it's worth walking through slowly. A charge of filing a false police report exists specifically for situations where a person reports something they already know isn't true. That's a meaningfully different claim than simply failing to report a death in a timely manner. It's an allegation that active deception was baked into the story from its very first sentence. The initial call, the tears, the description, down to the pink beads in her hair. If that charge holds up, it means the 4 days of searching weren't just built on outdated information. They were built, according to prosecutors, on a report designed from the outset to send investigators looking in the wrong place. That raises the question this case will likely turn on more than almost any other piece of evidence. What exactly happened in that house in the weeks between whenever Meria actually died and the night that 911 call was placed? Neither parent has offered a public account of that specific window of time. Neither is legally required to before a trial, but it's the gap at the center of everything. The search, the acreage, the drones, the billboards. All of it sits on top of a stretch of time that, as of right now, remains almost entirely unaccounted for in public. As of this recording, the area of interest outside Aiken County that the sheriff referenced in his announcement hasn't been publicly located, and recovery efforts there reportedly continue at a much lower profile than the helicopters and roadblocks that defined the first week of this case. The sheriff has said his office has stayed in contact with Meria's extended family and has asked the public to give them room to grieve. A family now carrying two realities at once, a granddaughter who is gone, and two of their own who are now the ones accused of taking her. So here's where we land, and it's worth naming both possibilities honestly instead of reaching for whichever one makes a cleaner story. What does it take for two parents to call 911, cry on camera, hand over a detailed description of their daughter down to the beads in her hair, and stand at the center of a search spanning thousands of acres, if they already knew, as prosecutors now allege, that she wasn't going to be found? There are really only two shapes that question can take. 1. Grief and denial can produce behavior that looks, from the outside, exactly like performance. Someone reports a loved one missing because part of them hasn't caught up to what another part already knows, and the search becomes a way of not facing it yet. 2. And this is closer to what the charges themselves imply. The search was staged deliberately. A way to buy time, a way to redirect attention outward onto a search area and a community, instead of inward onto a house. Nothing in this case has publicly settled which of those it is. That's what a trial is for. What is settled is this: a 4-year-old girl who should have had an entire life ahead of her didn't get one. And whatever a courtroom eventually decides about how that happened, that fact isn't going to change. Her extended family is left holding two realities at once: a granddaughter, a niece, a cousin who's gone, and two people they know now facing a courtroom over it. There's no version of this that gives them anything resembling closure soon. If you have any information related to this case, contact the Aiken County Sheriff's Office directly. One more thing worth noticing before we close this out, because it says something about this case specifically. Most true crime cases you and I cover take months, sometimes years, to move from disappearance to arrest. This one didn't. A disappearance on a Tuesday, a multi-agency search running by Wednesday morning, FBI behavioral specialists and child abduction experts on the ground within days, a sheriff's announcement, an arrest, and formal charges, all inside a single week. That speed isn't proof of anything by itself. Some cases break fast because the evidence is there to break them. Some take years because it isn't. But it's part of what makes this case feel different from a lot of the ones that end up in this kind of coverage. Cases that stay open for months with no named suspect, or cases where investigators are still waiting on a recovered body before they can even consider charges. This one didn't stay a mystery for long. It became a prosecution almost as fast as it became a headline. What hasn't moved fast, and may not for a long time, is the actual recovery of Meria herself. Search efforts for her remains reportedly continue, quietly now, away from the cameras that covered the first 4 days. Her extended family is left holding both halves of this at once, mourning a child who's gone, and watching two people they know face a courtroom for it. Somewhere in the weeks before that 911 call, something happened inside that house that nobody outside it has explained yet. Maybe it was an accident a family couldn't face. Maybe it was something the search and the false report were meant to bury under acreage and headlines. We don't get to decide which. A jury will. But if you lived on that street, if you'd watched helicopters pass over a house you'd walked by 100 times, with no idea what was underneath the story you were being told, would you have seen it coming? Let me know what you think really happened in that house in the comments. And before you go, I want to leave you with the same thing the sheriff himself couldn't fully answer at that podium. Somewhere in the record of this case is a stretch of about a month where a family kept living on that street, kept talking to neighbors, kept going through the motions of an ordinary life on an ordinary block, all while carrying something no one around them could see. Whatever the truth of that month turns out to be, It's a reminder of something uncomfortable, that the space between what a household shows the world and what's actually happening behind its walls can be so much wider than any of us want to believe. If you want to be here the moment this case reaches a courtroom, make sure you're subscribed, because this one is far from over. And if this case is still sitting with you the way it's sitting with us, that's exactly why we cover cases like this one. Not for the shock of it, but because somewhere at the center of every one of these stories is a child who deserved better, and a truth that's still owed to them. We'll be back with the next update on this case the moment there's a court date. Until then, take care of each other.